Okay, in this video we are talking about line quality, which can also be referred to as line variation or line weight. What I've done now that I have my image drawn on my final sheet of paper, I have outlined it with a Sharpie pen, and because you can get some nice fine detail with a Sharpie pen, and I'm going to begin by coloring in the obvious areas like the eye and the mouth. But once I have that done, it's important to go and add some visual interest by changing the weight of the line to show depth. So to do that, you would thicken the line where you would think a shadow would go. So like right here where the snail's shell goes and curves underneath this part of his shell, it would get slightly thicker there. And what I do is I don't thicken the entire line, I just go and I taper it into the rest of the line. And where it meets on the other side, I did that a little more than I wanted to, but it's okay. As long as you make it a gradual change and not a sudden change, it will usually turn out okay. So we're going to do it here because it's going behind the eye right there. You can use an ultra fine point Sharpie, but they do tend to bleed more than these Sharpie pens. And there's certainly nicer materials out there too, but I find that Sharpie pens work just fine, and for the price that they are, they're easy to find. So everywhere I think that there would be a shadow, I'm just going to thicken the line and then gradually taper it into the regular width of the line that I started with. A lot of times artists will bolden, I guess, or emphasize a line to draw attention to it. So because our snail, like if we had a lot of detail in the rest of our picture, like in the background, we would probably want our outline of our snail to be more bold so that it stood out from the background. But since we don't have a lot or anything right now in the background, we're just going to go in and add some weight to some areas of the line so it makes it look more interesting. And because the tail, the bottom here of the tail, that's where a shadow would be. A shadow is anywhere that a shadow is being cast, a darker area is being cast, because typically the light is coming from above. And that light could be the sun, it could be a flashlight, it could be just the light in the room, it could be the light coming from the window. So I'm gonna thicken this line right here. The good thing for you is if you don't really know where to put the thicker parts of the line, I've attached the final images, the reference photos on Google Classroom, and you should be using those as you add your line weight to kind of give you a guide. So in just a few places, I'll go through and I'll thicken it. I say just a few places, I am adding it to a lot of the areas, but it's visually going to make it stand out more, make it appear like you put more effort into it, more thought into it, more artistic choice. It also gives it the appearance that it's more illustrative and stylistic rather than just being a basic cartoon drawing. So we're getting there. Behind this eye, that's where a shadow would be, because the eye is in front of the snail shell. Sometimes I end up adding line weight where I just accidentally get outside the lines, because since it is a Sharpie, sometimes accidents happen. And the important thing to know is if you accidentally get outside the lines like this, oops, what you want to do is you don't want to make it a real like abrupt stop and then start the line back. You want to make it real gradual where it just gradually goes back into the original line you had, and then taper it back in until it gets back to the original width of the line that you started with. All right. Got outside the lines a little bit there, but that's okay. Because this is the bottom part of the snail, there'd probably be a shadow there. So you can really start to see that this is coming together. It definitely looks more interesting than when we started a few minutes ago. At the bottom of this wheel, I'm going to make this thicker. This, because it's at the bottom, that's typically where your shadow would be. So bottom of this line, bottom of this line, and then just taper it back into the rest of that line right there. I can move pretty quick just because I've done this before, but if you're not real used to doing this sort of thing and you don't use Sharpies that often, I strongly suggest going really slow and taking your time, because it is very easy to get outside the lines too much, and then it's hard to kind of reel it back in and keep everything looking nice and clean without getting too messy with your lines. So almost done. Last line here. Again, this is the bottom of the eye, so I'm going to add more of a shadow there. And I always have kids who will say, she just went through and like boldened every single line she had. It may appear that way, but actually you need to start strengthening your eye for attention to detail, because a lot of these lines are just get gradually thicker and then very gradually go back into the original line that I had. So it's important to not overdo it. Okay, now that I've added some line quality, this is still not complete. Now what we want to do is add more shading to it, and to do that with a pen, you're going to have to use some different shading techniques, such as cross hatching or hatching, or even scumbling, which is a weird word. Scumbling is what we're going to use for the texture of the snail, and it's basically like little bitty, in some places it may appear like dots, almost like little shapes in like the letter C. Sometimes it can be like a little squiggle or a, what's the word? Scribble. Intentional scribbling though. And then where you want it to be darker to create a shadow, you're going to add more of the scumbling on top of there. It kind of gives him just a, like he has actual texture to his skin. So he's not just completely smooth, but he has some little dimples or divots in his skin. But again, you should be looking at your reference photo, because that is going to help to guide you. If you've never done this before, that's going to be really important. And then underneath the snail shell here, it's going to get darker, so I'm going to add more of the scumbling, and by layering it on top of each other. Obviously I can't blend like I would with a pencil. Kind of looks like he has a beard there. So I can taper it, or I can kind of gradually spread apart my mark making, meaning like the way I'm applying the pen marks. I can gradually space them out more to give the illusion that there's still texture there, but there's not a shadow. So I'm gonna add maybe a little bit in some places to the eye, because you don't want the eye suddenly having a totally different texture than the body right there. So just a few places. And now I'm going to do something called hatching. Hatching is lines going in the same direction that don't intentionally cross. So right underneath here, we want to keep the same angle right here of these two lines of the skateboard, and we're going to create a shadow going underneath the snail, because if he were truly on top of this skateboard, there would be a shadow underneath him. And what you can see is, like, that's a good start, but our reference photo that we're working from right here, it gets much darker underneath the snail. So to do that, you just layer your lines, but you keep them going in that same angle, that same direction. They're going to crisscross a little bit, but you're not going to intentionally draw them perpendicular to the first set of lines that you did. It's important to kind of vary the lines, meaning like vary the lengths of them, because if you do them all the exact same length, it'll end up looking like just a black dark shadow, line underneath the snail. And instead you want it to be like it is gradually fading out. Not too harsh of a shadow, but it just gradually fades out to the rest of the skateboard. Okay, so now what we're going to do is something called cross contour lines. And cross contour lines are lines that go in the direction of whatever object you are drawing. So we know a snail shell is actually round, so our lines need to kind of follow the roundness of that snail shell. They don't need to be straight lines, they don't need to be crisscross lines, they just need to kind of slightly curve to show that the snail shell is also curved. And you probably add just a few more to the edges right there, because that's where a shadow would be. On the edges of things, there's typically a shadow. The thing to remember about Sharpie is that you can always go back and add more, but if you add too much, you can't really take it away, and it can be hard to fix at that point. So it's important to start out with not very many lines and go back and add more if you need to, but don't overdo it from the beginning. But cross contour lines, they cover the surface of the object you're drawing, and they go in the direction of the way the object goes. So like if we were drawing a flat object, our lines would need to be completely straight. But because our snail shell we're drawing and drawing attention to is curved, then our lines also need to go in the curve of the path that it's taking. It's like these lines kind of curved downward like this. In a way, they're also hatching. It's also an example of using hatching because the lines don't intentionally crisscross. And because back here there would be more of a shadow because it's going further in the distance, then we're going to add more lines back there and gradually space them apart as we move this way, because we want to not make it look too much of an abrupt shadow. We want to fade it out. This can be pretty tricky. It's always a good idea to try and practice a few times before you move on to your final paper. But we're almost done. And I'm not looking for perfection, but I am looking for effort. It can be pretty intimidating using a Sharpie on your final drawing, but we want to use Sharpie because the next step after this is to add color to it, which we'll do in class this week. So we have that. We need to add some scumbling to the little tail back there. Maybe add some shadows here. Sometimes I will just do some intentional scribbling, meaning like it's not going in a whole bunch of different directions. It's just filling in my space. That area can be a little bit darker. I'm working from my reference photo right here. And because it goes further in the distance back here, we also want to add a shadow back there as well. This is curving. Those are just more kind of fun lines that add some visual interest. Don't get overwhelmed or caught up about it being perfect, because that actually might stress you out more than if you just went for it and had fun. Even though Sharpie is permanent, we can always make a mistake work in your favor if you do accidentally mess up. So don't stress out if it doesn't look exactly the way that you wanted to from the beginning. And there we go. There is our line quality. There's our finished product for this step. You could always go back in and add more shadows if you need to. If you look at something and if you look at your drawing and there's an area that is really kind of blending in too much, like maybe the eyes, you can go in and you can bolden the outline, make the outline thicker so that it really contrasts with the rest of your drawing. I'm not saying you have to do it, but if you're looking at something and you're like, man, the eyes are the cool part of the drawing, and it just kind of blends in with all the lines on a shell, then maybe you should go in and bolden the outline a little bit more, because that will help to draw attention to that area. It's important to still have a focal point in your drawing. Okay, so I think we're done now, and the next step is to add color. So we'll do that in class this week, and I'll have a video for that later on. All right.